The Spiritual Brewpub Podcast will help you navigate spiritually after or during a belief shift, deconstruction, or crisis of faith. Not to try to convert you to a particular destination, but give you the resources you need to evaluate your future belief or unbelief and help you follow the religious historical evidence wherever it leads. I'm your host, Michael Camp, a recovering conservative evangelical, the operative word being recovering, sharing my journey and helping others rebuild faith or a reasoned philosophy of life. So grab your brew of choice and learn how fact-based history helps us both critique and rethink faith. Why do we call it a brew pub? Because we like to hang out in them, at least metaphorically. A pub is a great place to let your hair down, share your true thoughts about your journey, and discuss things with an open mind in a non-judgmental environment. Welcome, everyone, to the Spiritual Brew Pub. I'm your host, Michael Camp. We have a very special and fascinating guest with us today, Daniel Bannoura. He's a Christian Palestinian. He's currently a PhD candidate at the University of Notre Dame, and he's a former lecturer of comparative religion and Islamic studies at Bethlehem Bible College in the West Bank. Daniel was born in Jerusalem, and he's lived in Palestine most of his life and currently lives in the U.S. Daniel, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Michael. It's good to be with you. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm so excited that you could join us. I first heard you just a couple of weeks ago when you were on the New Evangelicals podcast with Tim Whitaker, and I was very impressed with your story. And frankly, it really did blow me away. So I really knew I just had to have you on my podcast. Our goal today is to get your perspective on four different areas. Number one, the Christian Palestinian heritage that you have and the history of that community. It's really fascinating. I've heard a little bit. I want to hear more. Number two, some of the history of the Israel-Palestinian conflict. I know that's a big question, but we'll cover some of that. Number three, your personal experience growing up in the West Bank and the occupied territories. And then finally, number four, addressing the challenge that Christians have and followers of Jesus' love ethic, or anyone who believes in the superiority of love, how we all have a challenge to love our enemies, and especially during this terrible Israel-Hamas war. So that's our goal. And before we jump in, I just want to preface it with saying that both of us are really on the side of all the victims in this war, both Israeli and Palestinian, from the victims of the Hamas attack and the hostages to the Palestinian civilians that are getting bombed or are enduring other suffering. We denounce violence on both sides and really seeking a non-violent solutions as much as that is possible. And we'll get to some specifics on that later. But why don't we start with hearing from your heritage? What we don't often hear from Palestinian Christians. So what is your community's history?
Yeah, thanks for asking, Michael. And I'm always amazed when people respond that way, like they're surprised to know that Palestinian Christians exist. And it is it's confusing to me because we exist, we're around, we've been around for a long time, but it's also shows kind of betrays a common phenomenon in the West and in the US especially, where there's a lot of apathy and perhaps ignorance and just misunderstanding and really harmful stereotypes and generalizations about the Middle East of being Muslims and Arabs and violent and and all these kind of just very harmful kind of attitudes towards the other, the people who look different, and they're just strangers and they ride camels and they live in tents, and very harmful stereotypes. And this is very common in the media. This is very common in film and TV. You have this very stereotypical kind of portrayals of the Middle East, and whether it's Disney's Aladdin movie, just very bad like portrayal of Arabs, or whether it's like
Right.
like TV shows about American intelligence and like fighting and wars and so on, that just portrays the Arab as just the violent, the very kind of plain, simple character who has no story except being angry and violent. And this is something that hopefully the audience could also like realize, like, yeah, we don't really know much about the Middle East, and we need to maybe do our due diligence, try to understand what's happening there and the culture and the history. So that's something that I have to keep reminding my friends, and especially being here in the US, like, hey guys, you need to do a better job how you think about the Middle East, especially because the US plays an oversized role in the foreign in its foreign policy and its policy towards the Middle East and Palestine and Israel. So the American population, especially Christians, hopefully, like would have a more educated and more nuanced understanding of what's happening over there.
Absolutely.
So that's kind of the general kind of framework that we have to understand the American bias and
Right.
ignorance, and how that also impacts the way we think about Palestine and Hamas and Israel and so on. So to answer that question directly, so I'm Palestinian, I'm a Christian, I'm an Arab. So Palestinian, I can just kind of unpack that. I come from a people that have lived for generations in the land that has historically been called Palestine, and if you look at the map of, like, if you type Palestine map, it's mostly, we're talking about the whole land that is now mostly considered Israel. So we call it usually historic Palestine or so on. It's basically that region from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River. And we've been around for generations and millennia. I can trace my family back to 13 generations of the Bannoura family that have been living in the Bethlehem area for at least that long. And the Middle East in general, and like Palestine within what is called the Levant, or the Middle East, which is not an accurate or helpful term. It's a very kind of Western term, right? Like there's the Far East, and there's the Middle East, and there's us, the center of civilization. So we are, the West is the center, and then this is the Middle East.
Right.
So it's a very kind of harmful, like Eurocentric and Western centric. So we don't really like that language, but we call but we are from what is called the Levant, or
what does the Levant mean?
I think it's a French word, and I actually, I don't really know what that's a good question. I don't know what that word means, but I think it's from the French. But it probably has also some kind of connotation of like imperialism and legacy of colonialism there. Right. We call it the most accurate term to use is Syria Palestine, to distinguish the Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine area, and then you have Mesopotamia or Iraq on the other side. Right. But Syria, Palestine have kind of been linked linguistically and culturally and historically together. Anyway, but to stick with the common phrase, the Middle East is a very multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilingual society. You have Muslims, and Muslims are the majority, but then you have very sizable Christian minorities. I think the numbers of Christians have went down in the last 100 years, and we can kind of talk about the history of wars and colonialism and how that impacted the Christian presence in the region. And then you also have other minorities. You have the Yazidis, you have Jews who have historically lived throughout the Middle East, in Palestine, in Egypt. Before 48, when Israel was established, you had a very sizable Jewish minority in Iraq and in Syria. We still have some Jews, I think, in Yemen and Morocco until today. And then you have, if I zero in on Palestine, historic Palestine, the whole area we're talking about, you have the Baha'is in the north. You have the Samaritans who live in Samaria, or what is today Nablus in the West Bank. And you have different ethnic and religious minorities throughout the land. So I'm from a Palestinian population of Palestine. In the 1917 British census over Palestine, so just the history background, we were controlled by the Ottoman. We had an Ottoman control, or occupation. And then the Ottomans were defeated in World War I. And then the British and the French had something called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, by which the colonial powers who won the war divided to divide the spoils of the war, and that included dividing up the Middle East or the Levant.
Right. So it went from one colonial power to another.
Exactly. So there's a legacy of colonialism that informs a lot of how we think about it, and I think that continues today. And I can explain that later. But then the British and the French came. It's like, hey, let's take over Palestine and what was called Transjordan, including Palestine and Jordan, and Syria and Lebanon and Egypt and so on and so forth. And that was by the end of World War One, up till the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, with a lot of these kind of eventually areas became their independent states, like Jordan and like Lebanon and Syria. Palestinians were under the British control until 1948, when Israel was established. Now, so in 1917, during the British Mandate, the early years of the British Mandate, Christian Palestinians were about 11% of the population. And they mostly lived in coastal areas and in city centers, like especially Christian significant cities like Bethlehem, like Jerusalem, like Nazareth, and some coastal cities, like I said, like in Haifa and Jaffa and so on. So my family is from Bethlehem, not from Bethlehem, the city itself, but from a small town next to Bethlehem called Beit Sahur, which is the Arabic word that means the house of those who stay up at night, and it's in reference.
Really?
Yes, so those, the Sahara, the ones are the ones who stay up at night, and it's in reference to the shepherds. So it's basically
it's not partying. Okay.
No, it's not partying. It's those farm shepherds who tend their sheep at night.
Gotcha.
And they stay out with their sheep. And Michael, and the connection to the biblical story here is evident. So Beit Sahur is basically the shepherd's field.
Yeah, shepherd's field. Right.
So it is named after the shepherds who were tending their flock when Christ was born. So I kind of come from that, like a history of a Christian presence. We say that Palestinian Christians have been around for 2,000 years, since Pentecost, since the first church of Jerusalem, and Christians continue to have a strong presence in the land. I can tell you more about like modern manifestations of Christianity and how we Palestinian Christians have been dealing with and thinking about the reality on the ground, and Christian Zionism, and how the Bible has been used to victimize the Palestinians, to justify what Israel is doing, and kind of this unconditional, unwavering kind of Christian support for Israel, using the text of the Bible, influenced by some kind of dispensational theology, or what we call Christian Zionism, that says that we need to support Israel, and so on and so forth. And we can talk about that and how we think about the land, who owns the land, what is the land, who are God's people.
Yeah, we want to get into that. But you said 11% of the population are Christians. Is that still true today?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, that's how I should have continued with the conversation. So we used to be 11% of the population, and then in the early 20th century, you had kind of mass migration of Jews from Europe into Palestine, driven by what is called Jewish Zionism or Jewish Zionism. We also have Christian Zionism. So Jewish Zionism is this kind of ethno-nationalist movement that wanted to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine, escaping persecution, influenced by other movements of nationalism, like you have in the French nationalism, or like American, independence, and so on. And like Jews were like, hey, some of them at least, and many Jews actually rejected that notion. Some Jewish Europeans were content to stay in Europe as Europeans. They were fundamentally European, and being in the Middle East was not something that they wanted. But then some of them, and also some of them who were religious, they refused the idea of establishing a homeland for Jews, because in their understanding of Israel, of the Bible, and of history, and of the Talmud, and kind of Jewish commentary, only it is the Messiah who establishes the kingdom of Israel.
Right.
And Zionists, the initial Zionists, were not religious. They were very secular, liberal / atheist.
That's a good point. I've read that about that. They weren't religious oriented.
Right. Yeah. They were just kind of motivated by kind of secular, kind of nationalist movements. But then they were like, well, hey, our people claim some kind of connection to the land in Palestine, so let's try to lobby and work hard to get that land.
Well, another interesting tidbit was I read that originally they weren't even thinking that they would make the homeland in Palestine. They were thinking of places like Uganda, even.
That's right. Yeah, Uganda and Argentina were on the table as well.
Yeah.
But looking into the what they can do and how strategic it was, it seemed to them eventually Palestine made more sense to
Right.
them, especially
That
because of
just
the
shows
British.
you that it wasn't a religious
Right.
driven
Yeah.
thing in the beginning. It's like, okay, where are we going to live? We'd like to live in Palestine, but we could live in Argentina or Uganda, right?
Right. Yeah. And
Yeah.
they were kind of open to they were having
Right.
these conversations.
Yeah.
But then there was this Jewish increase and influx into Palestine, so that limited the number of Christians and so on. But then the wars that happened since then in the 30s and then 47 and 48 and 49, what Israel calls the War of Independence, what Palestinians call the Nakba, the catastrophe of 48 and 67 and so on. And there's been an exodus of many Palestinian Christians from the land, mostly because of the political situation, a lot of it also because of economic kind of opportunities outside. A brain drain, a very kind of unfortunate reality where if you tend to be educated, speak a different language, considering the reality you're in, it's like, well, I would rather get out of here. So there's a kind of brain drain of educated Christians who just like opted out, especially because of connections they had in the West through churches and so on. So it's a long history of 100 years, but right now we're talking about 2 to 3% of the population is now Christian.
Only 2 to 3%. Okay.
So in what is called Israel proper, so outside of the Palestinian territories, we call them, and we can talk about that. You have like 5% of the population is Christian, and they mostly live in Nazareth and Haifa and some of the coastal cities.
Okay.
And some of the areas surrounding Nazareth. And then in the West Bank, you have them in East Jerusalem and in Bethlehem and some other kind of small towns. And so that's we're talking about a very small population now, 2% total. But if you talk about the Palestinian territories, which is the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, it's really down to 1% of the population. And that's just mostly affected by the harsh political reality of oppression, of the occupation, and so on. Yeah. So it's a very alarming kind of trend. And I'm a part of that problem too. My family left. My parents are in Palestine, but two of my siblings live in the US right now. My wife is American, and I live in the US right now, and there's a good chance we're going to stay here for a while at least. So there's an unfortunate reality that the land of Christ, where Christianity began, is now running short of followers of Christ in his land.
Right. That is, yeah. I see what you're saying. Yeah. So you start talking a little bit about the history of the area. Maybe we could dig in on that a little bit. I know it's a huge subject. There's all kinds of rabbit trails we could go on, but maybe just an overview of the Israel-Palestinian conflict starting in 1948 or that era.
Yeah, I'm happy to give a summary of it. I encourage people to also do like I said, do your due diligence and pick up some books. I can reference some books as I speak now.
And whatever books you reference, I'll put in the show notes.
Right. And also, Michael, I put together like a resource packet as well that includes a good number of books, including history books that people can also go through.
Okay.
So I'm happy also to provide that for the audience. So I mentioned the rise of Jewish Zionism in the late 19th century. The British Empire was expansive and in control of the Middle East and of Palestine especially. And Jewish Europeans, for example, the founder of Zionism, this nationalist movement, is Theodor Herzl.
Right.
And he was like a secular, I think he was an Austrian journalist. And he lobbied hard with a lot of the Zionists, those are the founding Zionist kind of fathers, lobbied hard with the British Empire to facilitate the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. You have this is a famous Jewish family in Europe, the Rothschild family, for example, has been also very influential and very resourceful, also in lobbying, especially in Britain. And you had many Christian Zionists as well, who believe that it's actually a good idea, a good thing to to bring Jews to the land, influenced by a lot of kind of end times kind of thinking about the Jews having to be in the land for Christ to come back. And it is the Christian Zionists, including a guy called Balfour, I'll come to him now, who really pushed very hard for the Jewish presence in Palestine, driven by theology, by the Bible, and that's important, but also driven by anti-Semitism. That you have so many Jews in Europe, so what do you do with all the Jews we have? The most obvious solution is, well, let's get rid of them and might as well put them in Palestine, since we control Palestine right now.
I gotcha.
So it's an unholy alliance between Christian Zionists, the colonial empire, the British Empire, and Jewish Zionists. Now, this culminated. So this did not begin in 1948. This is a 106-year-old war against the Palestinian people that began in basically officially in 1917 with the Balfour Declaration. So the Balfour was the prime minister of the UK at the time, and people can look this up and look up this letter he wrote to Rothschild, and basically making the statement that His Majesty's government looks favorably upon establishing a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And in other correspondence, he also makes the comment that we would not even consult the wishes of the local populations about this plan. Like, we're gonna do it no matter what. And this is kind of just part of us, like, yeah, we control this land. There are some Palestinians and Arabs who live there, but we'll bring the Jews there. So it began in really 1917 with after a lot of lobbying by the Zionists up until then, to start paving the way for a Jewish homeland. Jews began, some Zionists who were convinced by this, funded by the Rothschilds and other like wealthy, successful European Jews, began funding, especially a Jewish National Fund, JNF, moving Jews into Palestine and kind of settling in the land. So if you look up like maps of like early Jewish settlements in Palestine in the 20th century, you see they're kind of buying some land, taking over some land in the coastal areas of Palestine, and slowly kind of migrating into Palestine. Still not really significant. Most Jews were kind of okay with being Jews, and like European Jews, and also, like I said, religious Jews did not like the idea. Like, we're gonna be in diaspora until the Messiah comes back. That's how.
Oh, I see.
Until that Davidic figure who comes or the Mosaic figure who comes and brings us into the Holy Land. Otherwise, this is not our job, and our job is to be faithful, loyal citizens in wherever we are.
Oh,
okay. Now, all of that now was challenged and upended by the World War II and rise of Nazism, which is the horrendous attacks on Jews in Europe and the Holocaust. And that just made it clear to most Jews that we do not belong in Europe and we need to escape. And after that, and kind of a bit of a sense of guilt by the British and others, like, we need to like help the Jews get out of here. And there was a mass exodus of Jews from Europe into Palestine. And that was I think this is the third wave of Jewish migration into Palestine that eventually brought in so many Jewish refugees from Europe into Palestine. Now, so that's the Jewish Zionist narrative. And eventually by 1948, Jews declared the Jewish migrants. This is like the first generation, second generation of Jewish migrants, mostly first generation. They're saying, okay, well, we need to establish our independence. And in May 14th, 1948, they established the state, and then they waged a war against the Palestinians and the neighboring countries and won that war. And by 1949, they established control over 78% of historic Palestine. So now historic Palestine, that was all Palestinian. 78% of it by 1948 became Jewish homeland called Israel.
78%, right?
78%.
Wow. Okay.
So that's
but what you're saying is the colonial power kind of took over and kind of green-lighted Jewish people to immigrate there. But what made it so that the Jewish people got the the rights to have an independent country and not the Palestinians at that point?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack about the history there. That's kind of why I'm saying like people need to like study this stuff more. And it was
Right.
more complicated for the British, and they were trying to find some kind of resolution. Well, like we want the Jews to come. We said we would want them to come, and so on, especially after the 30s, after the Holocaust. But then what to do with the Palestinians? Um, and there was a talk about having a two-state solution, what is called the partition plan. In
Right.
37, there was the Peel Commission that was issued by Britain to try to think of like how can we divide the land between both people. And in 1947, there was the UN partition plan as well that basically divided the land between both peoples, while giving the European Jews the majority of the land, about
Right.
which more than half, like 52% of the land.
Okay.
Now, so that was kind of the attempts to like trying to placate both people and have like two nation states in one land.
Hmm.
So that's kind of been the colonial kind of efforts. Like they could not really deal with it. It was also Jewish militias at the time, and really terrorist militias, and this is kind of established now, where like bombing, like attacking British soldiers. So you had the bombing of the King David hotel in
I remember
Jerusalem
reading about that. Right.
that killed a lot, some of the British kind of military and government officials, and just kind of skirmishes between the Jewish militias and the Palestinians and so far. And like Britain was just like losing its control over the land, and like they just want to leave. They just want to get out of there. They couldn't control it. Um, in a way, it was like this kind of monstrosity they created, like putting two different peoples together in one land. And they's like, we don't have a dog in this fight anymore. We're just gonna leave, which is a very colonial thing to do, right? Like think of Africa, like how the land, like the borders were set up, and like, yeah, let's just do this, like draw these lines and create these countries, and
Exactly.
like let them
Right.
duke it out.
Right.
And that's kind of what I mean. This is not just even Palestine. Think about how Lebanon was created to create this kind of Christian country, and like you just put it, and then you included other ethnic religious minorities that made like the Christians in Lebanon also in a very precarious place. And the same thing with Iraq, putting different minorities that would not live together in one state. So anyway, it was all like just messy and
Hmm.
very ignorant and very just crass and like really bad policy. But if there's anything that, if the proper understanding of all of this is that all of this is the outworking of colonialism, of Western
Yeah.
imperialism
Colonial.
and its
Yeah.
involvement in Palestine and in the whole
Mhm.
region. So
Right.
and that colonialist ideology continues to function. um, Actually, before I talk about that, let me just talk about the Palestinian story. So the Jewish story, homeland,
Right.
escaping persecution, establishing a Jewish homeland. The Palestinians and the Arabs are like, well, we didn't really know what was happening. Jewish migrants started coming to Palestine. We didn't, like, Palestinians did not really mind having some small minorities who settled. They kind of brought some wealth with them and had their own kind of kibbutzes, their own kind of socialist kind of communities and farming, and they didn't really mind much. Eventually, Palestinians caught wind of what was happening, and mostly through translating Zionist tracts and writings, and especially writings by people like Herzl and Jabotinsky and other kind of Zionist leaders at the time. And they discovered, wait, this is a British is actually facilitating this, and actually, especially see this in the writings of Jabotinsky. They're actually planning to take over the whole land, and we need to we need to be aware of what's happening. But they had no control. The British had the complete control over the whole land. But then Palestinians eventually, especially by the 20s and the 30s, they realized we cannot stand idly for this. This is a colonial project.
Hmm.
This is an effort by the British to take over our land and bring some strangers, European refugees, European Jews, or Europeans for the Palestinians. Like, who are these people? They're coming from Europe here. So the Palestinians eventually like resisted, and there have been like some kind of uprisings and so on. And the British were trying to like keep the peace, but they couldn't really do it. But the Palestinians were like, this is not our problem. You're bringing European problems to us. We did not cause the Holocaust. We're not in charge. It's not our fault that Jews were attacked and victimized in Europe, but now we have to pay for the sins of Europe. Now you're dumping your problems on us.
Hmm. Hmm.
And the whole idea of partitioning the land is like, why would we give you our land, especially the coastal areas? If you just kind of like watch documentaries or like footage of Palestine in the 30s and the 20s and the 30s and the early 40s, the coastal areas were like the cultural hubs of Palestinians.
Oh,
So like,
is that right? Okay.
Palestinian history is mostly not in what is called today the West Bank. It's actually in cities like Nazareth and um, Nazareth is inside, but like Haifa and Akko and Jaffa, and these were
Oh,
kind of the centers of Palestinian culture, especially also in the north, in the Galilee area today. That's kind of where a lot of the Palestinian intellectuals were living, and a lot of kind of the poetry movement and the literature and the political like elite and the intellectual elites were like living in the Galilee area. Now comes the British and they're saying, yeah, we're going to give the coastal areas and the north to Israel, and Palestinians can have their state in what is today the heartland, which is basically what is today the West Bank, like in Bethlehem.
mm-hmm.
And these were like underdeveloped areas, and like that's not actually where our culture is. Like, like the coast is where you have your commerce, like where you have your trade and like your piers and your ports, and like
Right.
the main cities of our business and economy is in the coast. Jerusalem is the city center because it's Jerusalem, and you have some holy sites in Bethlehem and Hebron and so on, but that's not the center of our like history and culture. On the flip side, for the Jews, if you want to think of like in religious terms, their legacy, their history is in Hebron, is in Jerusalem, is in Samaria, which are today in the West Bank, in what Jews call the Judea and Samaria. So the whole division of like the land, why would the Palestinians give the land to anyone else? Like, if like Michael, if I come to you and I say, hey Michael, like I've been beaten up and I've been attacked and I was kicked out of my house, can I stay with you? You're going to be kind and say, yeah, come, I have an extra room, you can stay with me and you can pay me rent or whatever. You can buy this kind of like an acre of land I have here nearby. But then like 20 years later, I say, hey, Michael, I'm not going to leave. And I actually want to take the rest of your house or half of your, or give me like, give me like 5 acres of your 10 acre property.
Right.
What are you going to do, Michael? Right? Like, you're not going to give it to me. But if some foreign government comes to say, Michael, give that land to him, I'm like, no, I'm not going to give him my land. And that's the Palestinian story. We're not going to give up our land to foreigners who are supported by the colonial British kind of imperial,
right. That makes perfect sense.
Right.
Let me just interject one brief question here. Kind of begs the question. Back when Palestinian Christians were 11% of the population, and I assume there were some Jewish people that were still living there, and mostly Arab Palestinians, though, was everyone getting along before, during that time? Before the early 1900s, before
the Zionism and British Empire. We can, generally speaking, we can say it's been like any normal society. Actually, it's a long and rich history. We have some isolated instances of like violence or some kind of attacks on each other and sectarianism, but that's just more the exception to the rule. Okay. There's no ideal society. There's no like a peaceful society.
No, I'm not saying that.
I mean, look at American society right now. Like, look how like divided and like aggressive and mass shootings. No, look at the legacy of also ethnic cleansing.
We've had plenty of conflict.
Also like European medieval and like early modern histories, like the bloody history. I would say that the Middle East was actually more peaceful, and people actually were more
speaking,
more diverse and more tolerant, I think, than Western Europe was in the 19th century, like with the transatlantic slave trade, or with just fiefdoms and colonialism and like attacks and wars. Like, European history is a very bloody history.
Right.
For the most part, the Middle East has been relatively calm. I think the Ottoman Empire just had control over the region, and people just lived in peace. And like I was saying, that Jews were living in the area, like Egypt, Morocco, like Iraq, Yemen, throughout the region, and they enjoyed relative peace with their Muslim and Christian neighbors. And I think, and I'm trying to emphasize how diverse and enrich the Palestinian, the Middle Eastern
Right.
society, or the whole
Right.
region of West, what we call West Asia and North Africa, or what is called the MENA region, the Middle East and North Africa. Very rich and very beautiful society, and it continues to be in many respects. So yeah, for the most part, was a very good society, and from what we can tell from records and so on, that's actually much better than Jews were doing, much better than they were doing in Europe, and there was a lot of kind of vibrant ethnic and religious minorities throughout.
All right, that's very interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, you were talking about the analogy with the house and
right. Yeah. So the discourse we use, or the way we can understand the whole conflict, is a discourse of colonialism and how indigenous populations respond to that kind of that power, that imperial power. And in many respects, the story of the Palestinians is, as an indigenous population, is similar to the story of many indigenous populations throughout the world. Think of the Native Americans in North America, think of First Nations in Canada, the Aboriginals in Australia and New Zealand, indigenous populations living by themselves, and some mostly European white, peoples come and say, well, no, this is actually ours. There's a manifest destiny. This is the promised land to us. We're going to take it.
Yeah.
And we're going to, Lewis and Clark, let's go west. This is ours. But then, who the natives would stand up to you, but then who are these natives? These are the savages. They don't have culture. They don't have religion. They're not Christians. They're not white. Let's fight them. They are barbarians. They're savages.
Right.
Or maybe if they were using today's lingo, they would say these are the terrorists. These are the native terrorists who have no perspective and no point of view and no personality. We need to kill them.
It's the dehumanization of peoples.
Right. Yeah. And yeah, that's a good word. Yeah, there was a dehumanization of the natives. And the West has done this well, whether it's the African blacks, the dehumanization of them into chattel slavery, or the Native Americans.
Right.
So the Palestinian story is similar to that, just a long legacy of colonization, of dehumanization. Now, reaching 47, Palestinians rejected the partition plan by the UN, and just like, you colonial powers are not going to dictate what happens to our land. We reject this. And eventually, the Zionist militias, the Irgun and other militias that were at the time, basically coalesced together under the leadership of Ben Gurion, who became the first prime minister of Israel, and issued this plan. It's called Plan Dalet, D-A-L-E-T, Plan Dalet. And like anyone, just please look that up, read the text, and see what actually happened in 47 and 48. But basically, Plan Dalet, basically they work towards basically initiating the establishment of the Jewish homeland. Zionists were aware that the British were getting ready to leave, and they're like, okay, well, we need to establish a Jewish homeland for us right now in Palestine, so let's launch this military militia campaign, really a terrorist campaign. I'll explain to you why, where we can basically force the Palestinians out of their villages. So as you can read this in Plan Dalet, and you can see what actually happened.
Right.
They went throughout many Palestinian villages in what is today Israel, and they committed massacres. And we're talking about more than 24 massacres committed against the Palestinians, and just massive, just very aggressive military kind of militia movement or campaign to drive all the Palestinians out, and using
that's what caused all the refugees that we hear about.
Eventually, it led to the refugee problem,
right?
And began in 47. And if people just look up, massacres against Palestinians in 47 and 48, you can see lists of massacres committed. And then you go to a village, for example, you go to Deir Yassin. So people can look this up, Deir Yassin massacre, and then they go there and they kill more than 100 Palestinians, and basically, and everyone just flees, what, these are militias are fighting and killing us, and these are peasants, farmers, poor, they're not well organized, they don't really have many weapons, and basically that led to this exodus of Palestinians out of their homeland. Some of
Right.
them were
Now,
massacred.
let me just interject one thing. That the counter narrative to that I was taught in the evangelical church in America was that the refugees left because their Arab leaders told them to leave,
Right,
and
yeah, sure.
that's why they left. They
Yeah.
didn't leave because they were driven out by the new Jewish immigrants.
Yeah, so this is how do you sugarcoat your history, right?
Yes.
How do you make yourself the good person, and then you justify the oppression and the the
Hmm.
suffering of the other people. You come up with an excuse. The yeah, I don't know how we can quantify what happened. I'm telling you that massacres began to happen in 47, and this
Hmm.
was initiated by the Jewish Zionist militias. And it's easy for you to escape war. Like, look what happened in Ukraine, right? Like,
Hmm.
exodus of Ukrainians because of war. Look what
Right.
happened in Iraq and Syria. You don't have anyone to convince you. Like, look what's happening right now in Gaza. Like, they're leaving. They have to leave a war zone, right?
Hmm.
The Syrians did when ISIS was in power, just like mass exodus of Syrians out of Syria into Turkey and Europe
Right.
and the West.
Right.
You don't have no one has to tell you anything. I have kids. I don't want to die. I need to
No,
like
I
live.
understand. Yeah. I mean,
But it's just like,
I
this is like propaganda. Like, oh, we didn't really want them. Like, are you saying you didn't want them to leave? But then if you read the documents, you read Plan Dalit, you read, Herzl or Jabotinsky, or like I said, or Ben Gurion. No, the plan was to transfer the Palestinians. I mean,
yeah.
this is in the writings of all
Right.
of these people. Like, just look up the writings. Like, I keep quoting Jabotinsky. So, like, read the, I think it's called The Iron Wall by Jabotinsky, like an article he wrote. And he's just like, we are fully aware that Palestinians are not going to leave. We know that the Arabs of the land are committed to the land. And the only way for us to get them, we need to get them out if we have to
Right.
establish our Jewish
Right.
homeland. Plan Dalit was very clear. We have to attack border villages and towns and get the Palestinians out so that we can kind of carve out our own kind of state.
So one other question. Was there ever like a more of a egalitarian type of idea of like, why don't we form a country called, I don't know, Israel-Palestine or Palestine-Israel, and have everyone live together and get both of us we have our own country outside the colonial paradigm.
Yeah, that wasn't the discourse for either people. Like, the Palestinians were like, no, we're like, this is our land. We're gonna fight for it,
Right. Okay.
just like the natives did, just like anyone else, right? Just like the Ukrainians. We're not gonna let you have Crimea or take over eastern Ukraine. We're gonna fight for it.
Right.
And Palestinians had, and all Arabs had a very strong national identity. Like, this is our land. These are our trees. These are our crops.
Right.
And we are Arabs, and we speak Arabic, and our folklore, our language, our songs. Like, this is our national identity that we're not going to sacrifice. Also, because I kind of mentioned, this is like a European Western colonial project. Like, how can we share this with these people, right? And for the Jews also, and this continues to be today, or at least like you have to be careful. Not every Jew will believe this, not even today, but the Zionists, the whole idea was to establish a Jewish homeland. And especially after the Holocaust, like, we cannot live, and this is still a fact for many people, and we can talk about the legacy of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, but Jews, for the most part, especially at that time, just developed a very bitter distrust and of people, especially Christians. Like, we cannot survive. Like, we cannot depend on anyone to save us. We have to save ourselves.
Right.
And this is kind of, in theology, we talk about this kind of post-Holocaust theology. How do you deal with this? And Jews and Israelis have written on this a lot. Like, never again. We have to do this our own. We're not gonna let anyone else control our lives. So fundamentally, from the beginning, there was no there was no kind of synthesis of this kind of multinational bi-national state or a federation. The idea is we need to be a strong nation. Never again this would happen to us. The tragedy of all of this is that those who were victimized in Europe, those who survived the Holocaust, eventually became the victimizers.
Yes, that's right.
And
That's that part.
and
That's actually happens a lot.
right,
Throughout
yeah.
the
Hurt
oppressed
people,
become
hurt
the oppressors. Yeah,
right. Hurt people, right? Like
yeah,
yeah. And and the Zionist militias, the Zionist like religious and political leaders were like, why would they consider the Palestinians? Why would they try to work out a peace agreement? They're just motivated by this kind of, I don't know if it's revenge, but this kind of sense of we need to control, we need to have
right.
security, we need to create this fortress
Yeah,
that is called Israel, and we have to, no matter what, we have to protect ourselves, and we have to be strong, and we have to be
right.
Jewish, and so on. So that was never part of the conversation, and like from the 20s and the 30s, that was out of the question anyway. Like there was no efforts for peace. All the conversation was about the partition, the two-state solution at the time. Now this conversation continues today, and I think you see how this works out in Gaza right now, and we can kind of pivot to that. Um,
Yeah, I wanted to,
and
to
uh,
pivot a little bit here. Just if you have any closing thoughts on
well,
the
there's a
history.
lot to say since
I know
40 from 48 till
we haven't gotten to
2020.
67,
Yeah,
and
yeah, exactly. But yeah, so but there's, I think that I can just make the jump from here to Gaza when I talk about the refugees. So 700,000 refugees were made. They were pushed out by the militias. They were bombed. If you can, people can look this up. Like there's a Palestinian village in the north of Nazareth called Kufr Bir'im. There was a Palestinian Christian village. They didn't really kill people, but the militias came to them and says, "Hey, we're gonna bomb this your village in like 5 days. You need to get out of here." So they didn't have to like scare them, but they told them, "Hey, we're gonna bomb you. We're gonna bring our planes and bomb your village." And most people left. They went to Lebanon. They were like very north of the land, and they went to Lebanon, and some of them went to like Tiberias and Nazareth, and then
Mhm.
the Zionist militias eventually bombed Kufr Biram. This was like an exclusively like Christian village. If you go
Oh,
to Kufr Biram today, you see all the ruins there. They're still there. Like we have these living witness or like stone witnesses, these witnesses of what happened. And
mhm.
there's a church. There's like a standing church right now in Kufr Biram.
What year was that?
This is in 48, in
That was
47,
still 48.
48.
Okay,
Yeah. I'd
all right.
like the whole the
Yeah,
thing. Just
right,
countering this kind of just nonsense propaganda that
right.
Arab leaders trick them to leave. Um Ailabun as well in the north, more the coastal area, a very Christian village, was also ethnically cleansed. We're talking about 200 to 300 Palestinian towns and villages were ethnically cleansed. And
Wow.
speaking of references, Ilan Pape, Ilan
Yes, I'm
Pappe,
familiar with them. Right,
The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. That's the name of his book, The
right.
Ethnic
We'll
Cleansing
put
of
that in the
Palestine.
show notes. Yeah.
Sure. And he documents this declassified documents that were kind of unearthed in the 90s. And he shows just this brutal campaign of ethnically cleansing Palestine. And just also like that, you need to have the stomach for it, because the records are very like gruesome, like what
Oh,
actually
really?
they did to the
Okay.
Palestinians. And we actually had like soldiers recently, and you can like have to search for this, but like soldiers in 48 and so on, later on in the 90s and the 2000s, actually spoke up about what they did, and they were like telling, yeah, we're just gonna going and shooting people around. Like they had zero regard for the Palestinians.
Hmm.
And there's a lot, like there's a lot of stuff out there for people to read. um so yeah, there's, so it continues there. From there, Palestinian resistance continued, but the majority of the Palestinian population became refugee populations. Like I told you, the
Right,
majority of the population was in the coast and
right.
in the Galilee area. Eventually, Israel took over that, and those who remained became under the military occupation. For example, in the Galilee, like in Nazareth. And then some of the Palestinian refugees ended up in the West Bank and in Gaza Strip. So, for example, Bethlehem has 3 refugee camps: Aida,
Oh,
Dheisha,
okay.
and I forgot the third one right now. But
Mhm.
refugee camps throughout the West Bank and throughout the Gaza Strip. Palestinian resistance continues. Eventually, in '67, Israel, I'm telling you, this is like, and you can read about this. Israel is fundamentally interested in taking over the whole land and not about sharing the land. 67, supposedly a preemptive war was waged by Israel to take over the rest of the land. So they took over the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and kind of enforced military occupation. and started moving their populations into these areas. So you have the settlements in the West Bank and also in
Right.
the Gaza Strip. A lot of stuff happened since then. I'm
So up
gonna
until
jump.
67, that were the Palestinians, did they have autonomy over those lands?
Palestinians never had any autonomy at that time. After in 49, when the war was over, basically there was like a ceasefire announced, and by that, and in the ceasefire, the agreement that was done through the UN and so on is to basically the Palestinians who stayed in what was eventually called the West Bank of the Jordan River
Right.
to come under Jordanian control, and then the Palestinians who were pushed into the Gaza Strip came under Egyptian control, and that was kind of basically a temporary solution until we can figure out what like the final
Right.
status
So
solution would
they
look like.
never had autonomy, but it got worse after 67. That's what you're saying, because the
So
military.
yeah, so that was temporary, and then Israel was like, no, we're going to take over the whole land, and then
Yeah.
Israel came and then quickly in 5 days defeated the Jordanians and the Egyptians, and
Mhm.
both peoples were not really interested in all of this anyway. So they basically gave very quickly. Israel took over, and Israel was very weaponized and very militarily superior to these countries, and
Right.
eventually took over.
Right.
And then Palestinians have been living under occupation since then,
Yeah.
and that includes
Right.
Gaza, includes and the West Bank, and especially in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, including like my family, Bethlehem, where we live.
Right.
We live under a very brutal military oppression and occupation, where checkpoints and walls and control of the infrastructure, limited
And you
access.
were born in Jerusalem, right?
Mhm.
And you grew up in Bethlehem. I mean, what was that
Right.
like personally? Your personal experience? What was that like?
Yeah, I guess kind of that's the next section you want to talk about. So yeah, I grew up under a military occupation, soldiers around controlling my everything. Every city, at the exit of every city, there's a checkpoint manned by soldiers. People can just look this up: Israeli checkpoints in the West Bank, and they see what they look like. Every city in Palestine, in the West Bank, they're like a checkpoint at the entrance and the exit. I think we were talking about like 300 checkpoints in the West Bank,
Wow.
and basically controlling the movement of all Palestinians. So if you wanna lock Palestinians in Bethlehem, you just close the checkpoint, and all the roads are closed, and then people cannot leave.
Mhm.
Um, and you have the wall, the what we call the apartheid wall or the separation wall, and you can see pictures of it or the map. You can see kind of goes through the West Bank, annexing Palestinian land into Israel. Bethlehem is, for example, surrounded by two sides by this wall, and there's like you basically trap the people within those areas. You take over a lot of their farmland, so a lot of Palestinian lands are in Bethlehem are taken from them, especially like olive groves, and they don't have access to it, and it's now under Israeli control. The
Mhm.
aquifers, the western part of the West Bank is a very like fertile land, and there's a lot of kind of water, underground water and aquifers. All of that is controlled by Israel. Palestinians do not have a right to like dig up the water from the aquifers. All the water is taken from the aquifers and to the Jewish settlements that are in the West Bank. My family from Bethlehem, we lost 11 acres of land for a Jewish
Wow.
settlement next to Bethlehem. It's called Israel calls it the Har Huma settlement. We call it the Mount of Abu Ghneim. But all of the whole, it's basically like a hill that was all taken by the Israeli military, and now you
Mm.
have Jews from like Brooklyn or Poland or Russia or whatever live there. Uh, and even though this was a land that belonged to my family
No
for generations,
compensation. They just
no
took the land.
compensation. No. This
Yeah.
is a military. Like they control every aspect. There's no.
Right.
I think they some settlements they tried to sell land to Palestinians, but Palestinians refused. And for the most part, we had no power, no effective power. Even if you try to lodge a complaint in the Israeli military court, all of these complaints would just be rejected. And that's why you have the Israeli settlements in the West Bank. In the Gaza Strip, eventually Israel in 2005 disengaged from the West Bank. They moved the settlements out, or they moved just remove the settlements from the Gaza Strip.
From Gaza, yeah.
From the Gaza Strip, the settlers moved from the Gaza Strip into the West Bank. It's not like
Oh,
they went back to
okay.
Israel. They moved, and the Israeli military could not really handle the Gaza Strip, so they moved from within the Gaza Strip into the outside. And in 2007, they enforced a blockade over the Gaza Strip. It's been going on for 16 years now. A very inhumane, brutal blockade of the Gaza. It's been described as the world's largest open-air prison, which is not even accurate language. I mentioned this to Tim. This is actually more of a concentration camp.
Right.
Because if you're in prison, it basically implies that you're guilty. That's why you're in jail. But it's actually a concentration camp where the guards control the outside and the Palestinians are stuck there. A humanitarian disaster there. Unemployment is skyrocketed. Palestinians in Gaza cannot leave at all. Some of them get to leave, like a few hundred of them get to work in Israel.
Yeah, so that was a question that came up because a lot of people, when you talk about this, they go, "Oh, it's not that bad. They can go to work in Israel and they can come back." And there's all this aid that comes in or trade that comes in over the borders. How do you?
That's nonsense. Yeah, aid. I mean, like in the Gaza Strip aid.
No, like trade, or like having trade with Israel or something or whatever.
Yeah, Israel wouldn't mind having trade with, like, Israel doesn't mind if the Palestinians just submit. Like, yeah, of course. Why wouldn't they, sell their products to Palestinians? Like it's good for their economy. The occupation pays. It pays Israel to have the occupation. One, it has a compliant, controlled, occupied population that relies on Israel for its livelihood, and it pays taxes and buys products. It pays from the U.S. There's military support from the U.S. We're talking about like $4 billion a year that is given to Israel in the form of military aid. It pays Israel to have the occupation. And as long as the Palestinians do not resist and they remain to be a tolerable minority, and they tolerate it and they're not making any trouble, Israel doesn't mind us there. Like, it's good business for Israel.
So you had said only a few hundred people were giving work permits.
I think so. Gaza. So going back to Gaza, I think there are like 2.3 million Gazans living in the Gaza Strip, and the Gaza Strip is super small. It's like 360 square kilometers. I think it's like 180 square miles.
25 miles by 5 miles. Yeah.
There you go. Very tiny area, and 2.2 or 2.3 million Gazans, and I think a few thousand of them get permits to work in.
A few thousand,
Israel.
okay.
Like a few thousand. Like, this is not significant. They're mostly traps, and Israel uses like Palestinians as cheap labor. Like, they pay them way less. I mean, it's also, this is common in the U.S., right? Like, you have the cheap labor market in the U.S. as well. So yeah, I mean, if you can work for cheap, and we'll pay you as long as you remain occupied and submit to what we're doing.
The point is that they're not free to go and leave and do what they want.
No. Every aspect of Palestinian life throughout the whole land, every non-Jew is controlled by the Jewish state, by Israel. This includes the Palestinians in Gaza who live under blockade with this policy of an eyedropper that gives them some water here, gives them like electricity 11 hours a day, calculates how many calories each Palestinian needs, and allow this much food based on the calorie intake they deem that is enough for the Palestinians. No, they're trapped in this prison and they cannot leave or travel or anything. Like, it's a very the UN came out in 2020 or in 2015 saying that by 2020 the Gaza Strip is going to be uninhabitable. It's a very densely populated, destroyed infrastructure, no sustainable economy.
The point about the economy is that you can't build an economy if someone is controlling everything that comes in, and you don't have a free market to develop.
Yeah, you have no control. You cannot sell your products everywhere. And this is an issue. Like Gaza is very fertile and they have good farmland, very limited and small. But they have for example, they're known for their strawberries. But they produce strawberries and and they basically go to waste because they can't sell them outside.
They can't sell them outside Gaza. Yeah.
So that very destroyed economy. There's no it's not a very unsustainable reality. 50 or 60% unemployment, 60 or so 70 under 70% under the poverty line. Just a very decimated kind of reality, very like harsh.
Right.
98% of the water is undrinkable, and there's no viable economy. 70% of Gazans are refugees. So these are the people, and this is maybe kind of talking about like what happened recently. 70% of the population of Gaza are refugees, are second and third generation refugees. They are not from Gaza. They are from what is today called Israel.
Right.
And they don't want to be in Gaza. They have, and if you like look up search for the picture of like refugee camps, like Palestinian refugee camps on Google, you would see pictures of the key. A key becomes a symbol for the refugee. And it's basically the Palestinians who fled in 47 and 48. They lock their doors, put everything on their back, whatever they can take with them. They lock the door and they left, thinking that we'll be gone for a few weeks and then come back. 75 years later in Gaza or the West Bank, they're still refugees. Wow. And not just within. Most of the refugees actually live outside the land. So you have the biggest refugee population is in Jordan. You have sizable minority.
A lot of them live in Jordan, right? Yeah.
A lot of them in Syria and Lebanon as well, and also in diaspora, people who just kind of basically got some kind of asylum and then they moved to different countries.
Right.
But most of them, the majority of the Palestinian population, and hopefully this kind of just would shock people. The majority of the population of Palestine are refugees. The majority of Palestinians are refugees, and that majority is not even allowed to come back to Palestine or the whole land.
Right.
And those who are refugees within the land in the West Bank and Gaza Strip cannot even leave the West Bank and the Gaza Strip.
Right.
So before we talk about Hamas, but for a lot of these people are saying like, we need to get out of here. We want to go back. We have a right. This is what Palestinians call the right of return. We have a right to the land that we lost in 48. This is our land. This is where we grew up, and we need to go back there. But that's the reality. Before let me just finish with the last point. The whole reality in the whole land, in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, in the Gaza Strip, and also within Israel proper, the rest of it, the majority, the 78% of the land, where you have also Palestinian citizens of Israel, or what Israel calls Arab Israelis. The language is important. You're saying they're not Palestinians; they become Arabs.
Yeah.
And that language is important and very problematic. They're not Arabs, just like you're not English, Michael, because you speak English, right?
Right.
They're Palestinians. Their culture is Palestinians, but they are citizens of the state of Israel. The whole land, the whole system has been described aptly, I think, insufficiently even, I think, by Palestinian human rights organizations, by Israeli human rights organizations like B'Tselem, by Human Rights Watch, by Amnesty International, and by the UN. The system that exists between the Jordan River to the Mediterranean is a system of apartheid,
right,
or Jewish supremacy above the Palestinian population. If people can see me, or on the podcast, it's basically people here, and then you have a people on top of them, or one Jewish supremacist population that controls the indigenous populations. Or the description has been given to us by also like South Africans and blacks in the US. It's a relationship between the neck and the boot. You have a boot on the neck of the Palestinians.
Right.
So it's an apartheid system it is very similar, not identical. We're not saying it's identical. It is very similar to apartheid South Africa. And that is the context. And I grew up in that system. Gazans grew up in that system, and all Palestinians are part of that system.
Right. No, that's a whole. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff there but people have gone in there. I've read that South Africans have gone in and observed what's going on. They go, "Oh yeah, this is definitely apartheid. It's actually worse than we had it."
Yeah, you had people like Mandela. You had Desmond Tutu.
Right. Yeah.
Frank Chikane was in Bethlehem. He's an Anglican priest. He
Yeah.
was active in the anti-apartheid movement. He
Right.
came to Bethlehem, I think, in 2020, and he was like, to call it apartheid is actually an understatement. Like, this is actually much worse, more so
Right.
than apartheid. And I don't think the language is, I mean, the language is helpful, but it's not, it's limited, because there's an issue of the legal system is apartheid, but it's also a system of settler colonialism, that you
Mhm.
move your populations and then you settle in, you use colonial methods to settle in the land and to push the people out. So
Right.
apartheid is only one way to describe the reality. It's actually much worse than that.
Right. So I want to pivot at the end here and talk about your faith. And in particular, there's a huge challenge here. Here you are, a Palestinian Christian follower of Jesus, and and following the love ethic that Jesus taught, which includes love your enemies. And we've got this system that you're under. What is those challenges like for you as a Palestinian Christian to love your enemies? And how could this possibly be a solution if people could get a vision for actually on both sides to actually stop dehumanizing each other and start loving each other?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, Michael, and that takes a long time, I think, to unpack. But just gonna, I'll put this within the context of what just happened in the last 3 weeks. I think because that's what people are thinking about.
Right.
So Hamas broke out of jail, out of prison, out of the concentration camp, and like I said, these are refugees. We're not surprised that 3 generations later, the repressed would revolt and would go out, would break out of jail. There's no justification to like the killing of civilians and the killing of anyone. I think, and I'll talk about my faith and how I think about violence and so on. But they went on this kind of rampage,
Right.
targeting Israeli civilians and soldiers, and killed, I think 1,300 of them.
Mm-hmm. Soldiers and civilians, yeah.
Soldiers and civilians, yeah. There's a conversation there for people like Hamas and some Palestinians are saying, well, every Israeli is actually a soldier, because every Israeli serves in the military. There's like mandatory military service for Israelis. Right. So for some Palestinians, including Hamas, they're saying, well, each Israeli is actually a soldier. Each person actually oppressed us, are part of the problem.
I see. That's how they look at it. Okay.
That's how like Hamas would. Yeah. So I mean,
Hamas
it's interesting. At least Hamas would say. I mean, also like there's a lot of nuance to add. Some of the footage that came out, like from Hamas. I mean, this is Hamas propaganda, but they're showing it's like, yeah, we're treating women well, and they basically just kind of target men or those who are fighting them. And you saw some footage like from like cameras and so on, where they they basically tell the women to leave, and they and then you also saw some like terrible, like you hear some terrible stuff from Jewish survivors of the Hamas attacks.
Mm-hmm.
One of them is actually very sweet story. This woman told me this, this person came into my house and he was like, I'm a Muslim. God tells me not to attack women or children. I'm not going to attack you. And he's like, I just want to hide in your house. This is like, actually, like there's a report of this like in Israeli news. And he was like, can I, and he sees a banana on her like countertop. And he's like, can I have a banana? Like he asked for permission. And then she was like, yeah, have a banana. So he sits there, has a banana. And then like 2 hours later, he kind of leaves. Which was like a very interesting way to look at it. Some also tragic stories of one other Jewish Israeli survivor was telling she was on the radio, Israeli radio, and she was saying that, that the Hamas militias came in and they had like 10 hostages with them in this house. And then the Israeli military forces came there and they started shooting at the Palestinian militias. But then there was like nothing could be done. So eventually the Israeli military bombed the house and it killed like 10 Israeli citizens, the hostages, with the militia members. And these were like, and they basically burned the whole house down. And that's the Palestinian militias were burnt along with the Israeli civilians. So just, we don't have a lot of information about what happened, but it's very dark. But Hamas committed crimes, war crimes, and just heinous attacks against civilians and the hostages and so on. Now, Israeli response, and I kind of alluded to this kind of mentality of creating a citadel or like a fortress for Israelis, and Israel is like would not have it. So Israel immediately declared war on the Gaza Strip, and their decision was like, we need to eradicate Hamas. And for the last three weeks, since October 7th, they've been waging a war on Gaza. So far, as of today is Thursday, October 26th, more than 7,000 Gazans have been killed.
Yeah, it just goes up. I mean, I just wrote an article and it was 4,000, and now it's 6 or 7.
So now it is, today, this morning was 7,000, more than 7,000. Wow. And including, I think, 2,500 children. The Palestinian, the population in Gaza, 50% of the population is under the age of 18.
Mm-hmm.
And like, how come it's such a young generation? It's because of the dreadful humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip anyway, but it has such a very low, very high mortality rate, like very low life expectancy.
Right.
So that the half of the population is under 18. That's how like dreadful and like horrible life is in the Gaza Strip before any of this happened.
Yeah.
But 7,000 Palestinians, mostly women and children, were killed. More than, I don't know the numbers now, honestly, just very sad. And it's like, it's so hard for me like to just give these names, especially when you say like large numbers, like 2,000. But 2,000 children, just think these are 2,000 kids from families.
Mm-hmm.
And all of them are worth so much and beautiful and have dignity and loved by God. But they're killed left and right. 18 Christians were killed in a bombing at a church. At once, like 300 and 400 Palestinians were killed in a hospital attack. We're not really sure if it was a Palestinian rocket or an Israeli rocket. Like, we have different reports. The New York Times came out 2 days ago saying it's not from Hamas. It's not from a rocket from Jihad or Hamas. But anyway, destruction of neighborhoods, the usage of white phosphorus, which is considered illegal in like warfare. Mass destruction of properties, of neighborhoods. I have friends in Gaza, and it's just been super like tragic. I have friends who lost a friend who lost his dad, a friend who lost two cousins. The Christians, I didn't know the Christians who were killed, but a friend of mine from Gaza lost a lot of his classmates, and two of his classmates were killed. And just a lot of kids were killed, and it's just been super, super tragic. Now, so just to answer
just want to add one other thing. In addition to the deaths, we have the injured and the trauma of going through this kind of a bombing. And there's a movie called Born in Gaza. I don't know if you've seen it, but it tracks 10 Palestinian kids, I don't know, between 8 and 14 years old or something, and after the 2014 war, and what they had to go through and the trauma that they experienced. So that's the other side. It's just not in addition to the deaths, it's the people who are surviving under that trauma. And there's trauma on the other side too, with the hostages and people losing loved ones in this Hamas attack. So it's on both sides. But what we're really doing here is we're talking about highlighting some things that aren't necessarily highlighted in mainstream media that are going on in Gaza.
I would. 2 points. I mean, you bring up such good points here. The trauma is important. So 18,000 people, I think, so far injured in Gaza. 7,000 killed. And then Israel thinks that by doing so, it's going to stem out Hamas. And I'm like, if you lost your wife or your kid, or you just lost your dad, are you going to tell me you're not going to grow up bitter and angry and vengeful? You're not going to pick up a gun and avenge those who killed your wife? Like, this mentality that bloodshed, especially this way that it's been done and it's been described as a genocide, Like, you really think that this is how extremism or terrorism ends? And I use the word terrorism, like, I have a lot of problems with this term, because it's basically used to say, if we describe anyone as a terrorist, we can just kill that person. He doesn't
Right.
deserve to live.
It's
He's not a
dehumanizing them. Yep.
he's nothing. He's as good as
Right.
dead. um I mean, Hamas terrorized Israelis. I mean, they committed some heinous attacks. But are we in the same breath? Are we in the same using the same language to say that Israel is also, the Israeli military is a terrorist military and is terrorizing not just a few thousand, millions of Palestinians who've been bombed every day? And I try to talk to my friends in Gaza, and I have a hard time talking to them because there's no power, there's no electricity for
Right.
them.
Right.
Once in a while, they get power for like a few hours, and they kind of check in and respond, or you know, tell the world that we're okay, or to announce that some of their relatives were killed. Um, these people are not terrorized, like. But also, like, speaking of like that documentary you said, and there's another one that I can recommend. It's called Killing Gaza. So just type
Hmm.
Killing Gaza documentary. Uh, you if you are 20 years old, like, let's say you're a Hamas militant, if you're 20 years old, in the last 16 years, since you were 4 years old, you experienced 5 wars. Israel
Right.
launched attacks on Israel, on Hamas, in 2008,
Right.
2012, 2014, and 18, and 21, and now today. You lived through 4 or 5 wars in your lifetime. You lost someone. And we're talking, each time Israel kills
And
hundreds
you
and
were
sometimes thousands.
traumatized as
You're
well.
traumatized. Why
Yeah.
wouldn't you join Hamas?
Yeah.
Like, it makes so much sense. Not please, like, please
Not
don't,
excusing
I'm
it,
not
but
justifying at
understanding it.
all.
Yeah.
But
Right.
this is violence and trauma and abuse and oppression. It leads to extremism.
Right.
So we have to understand the context of 75 years of oppression, of dispossession, of a refugee problem, stuck 75 years in refugee camps, no political horizon, no hope in the future, and complete, like, violence and aggression and killing of Palestinians left and right, settlement militias and attacks in the West Bank, attacks on the Temple Mount or the Aqsa compound against worshippers in Jerusalem, dehumiliation in the Gaza Strip, and a very gruesome and brutal blockade, and no horizon for, and Palestinians have been ignored. Like, there's nothing that Israel wants to do. Israeli generals were making the statement that there's no occupation. Not that the occupation doesn't exist. It's just like, act as if there's nothing. There's no
Right.
Palestinians. There's no occupation. There's nothing to say about the Palestinians. Let's go try to have the peace, the Abraham Accords, and normalize relations with other countries, because the Palestinians are insignificant. They are worthless. And kind of to your point about dehumanization, Palestinians have been consistently dehumanized for 75 years.
Hmm.
75 years, that open wound of the Palestinians, and it's still open. And there's no political will. Israel, for the Palestinians, is an apartheid state, an oppressive state that has brutalized and killed Palestinians by the thousands since 48, since the massacres of 47 and 48, and continues to do this. Before the attacks, Michael, you're not hosting me. You're only hosting me because of, after, like, me speaking up after the attacks in October 7th.
I
Before
know.
October 7th,
I know.
300 Palestinians were killed. Not in Gaza, not because of Hamas, 300 Palestinians in the West Bank, including 38 children in the West Bank. This is not Hamas. This is Israeli occupation in the West Bank. Where was the outcry? Where were the panels? Where were
Right.
the podcasts when you have so many people killed? And I don't know if you know about this. There was a Hawara pogrom. Jewish settlers went into a Palestinian village called Hawara, and they burned the village down, killed inhabitants, burned their houses and their cars. Where were the podcasts and the condemnation, and, like, we need to support Palestinians against
Right.
the settler terrorism? We're only talking about this because Israelis were killed, not because Palestinians were
No,
killed.
you're right.
Yeah.
It's shameful, but I mean, and I think there's the counter narrative is strong, and the media doesn't report on this. But
Right.
on the other hand, occasionally it does get through, and we're kind of numb to it.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
just like,
Exactly.
you know, It's
But
like
that's
too far away. And,
yeah,
and we think, well, they're working on the two-state solution. We hear this stuff, but it doesn't work.
yeah. The U.S. is not interested in that. I mean,
We have, yeah,
they pay us lip service talking about the two-state solution, but
yeah,
you have
right.
someone like Trump or Biden. I mean, this is a bipartisan issue. There's like
Yes, it is.
unwavering, unconditional support
Yes,
for Israel. Thankfully, there's some change in the Democratic Party, but it still remains a very small minority.
right.
Um, so I'm kind of, this is like a long response to your question about faith. So the Western and American response to the attacks and what's happening is unconditional support. And you have Christian leaders who are coming out with Hamas is pure evil. There's no
Yes,
justification. We don't
right.
have to think about context. We don't want to try to even understand what happened. This
Hmm.
is pure evil. These are terrorists, and therefore let's exterminate
We're
them.
justified to do it to them. Yeah.
Do anything you want. And you see like
Hmm.
the candidates like Nikki Haley, like DeSantis, just raise it to flatten Gaza, kill them all. And this is just a very nasty bloodthirst. And honestly, like if Nikki Haley, so I think Nikki Haley said, flatten it or exterminate them. Imagine if a Muslim person said this, exterminate them all,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
Oh,
Yeah.
he's extremist. He's Muslim. He's
Yes.
violent. He's a terrorist.
Right. Yeah.
But Nikki Haley can say it. Like Christian leaders can say it. Like people like Russell Moore and others, like in the Gospel Coalition. Like in the Gospel Coalition, there's an article comparing the Palestinians to the Amalekites,
Oh,
which were
yeah.
like an ethnically cleansed like people group in Canaan.
Right. Right.
Just like
Yeah.
we have the Israelites
Right.
ethnically cleansed, killed them all, do the same thing to the Palestinians.
I know, but and it's so shocking. I mean, growing up in or spending 25 years in evangelicalism, this concept, one of the biggest concepts in Jesus' teachings is love your enemy. Okay,
Mm,
be restorative, not retributive. Don't use reciprocal violence. Eye
right,
for eye, tooth for tooth. Right, totally being ignored, completely ignored
right, yeah, yeah.
in this context. It's just crazy.
Yeah, yeah. So this kind of Christianity, I'm like this is not Christianity. Like this is not my God.
Yeah,
This is not my gospel. This is not my Christ.
right.
And I mean, the West has to repent. Christianity in the West needs to acknowledge this issue. A number of us Palestinian theologians. I'll give you the link to this. This is an open letter that a number of us wrote. Palestinian Christian open letter
Oh,
to
good.
Western
We'd like to
Christians.
see that. Yeah.
And it's like you guys need to like repent. Like this way of thinking is harmful to the gospel. It harms your
Mhm.
witness. It's this kind of this just war theory idea that we describe anyone as evil and then exterminate them because it's a just thing to do. It's like, how dare you use the words of biblical words of justice and righteousness in that way to justify the killing of thousands of innocents in Gaza right now, and to
Right.
turn a blind eye to 75 years. How long are
Right.
Palestinians
Of
supposed to wait?
apartheid, right?
How many Palestinians need to die before you wake up? But this is church leaders. This is Russell Moore. This is David French. This is politicians. This is media pundits. This is everyone. Kill them all. And like I'm tired of this. This is just awful. This is you're defaming the gospel. So my position and the Palestinian Christian position, and I can end here. It's we just really take Jesus seriously. Like you said, love the enemy. Like how can you love the enemy and then exterminate the enemy? Like how does that make
Right.
any sense? If
Right.
Hamas is the worst people, let's just say they're terrorists. Okay, Jesus says, love your enemy. What does that mean? But if you say they're terrorists, you don't have to love the terrorists. You love the enemy. You don't love the terrorists, right? Like you kill the terrorist. But like how, like, and this is for me as a Palestinian, like two main commandments: love God, love your neighbor. I need to love my Israeli oppressor. I need to love the system, the person who does this to me. And I'm also commanded to love the enemy. Love my neighbor, love my enemy. I have no choice but to do this. How dare you come and say I follow Jesus and I'm a Christian and therefore I'm gonna defend Israel no matter what? The way of the gospel, the way of Christ is a radical vision of love and of inclusion, a gospel that is good news to everyone, especially to the marginalized and to the oppressed. Christ in Luke 4, he opens Isaiah and he says, this is the year of liberation, of freedom, and this has been fulfilled in your midst. And he goes about this ministry of reconciliation and of truth, of this banquet of including everyone in, of the women and the Samaritans are welcomed into this kingdom, and the tax collectors are loved. We have a theology that says, no, these people are ugly, these people are dirty, they need to be killed, they need to be exterminated. And it's the same language of the Pharisees, it's the same language of the leaders, the Jewish leaders of the time. These people are in, these people are out, these are dirty, and we're the clean ones. And the gospel of Jesus is a gospel of truth and the gospel of mercy and justice, and the biblical justice and understanding of justice. And I can finish here. Justice of God, or the righteousness of God, has been seen on the cross, that Christ did not act in vengeance or in violence. He actually took up suffering. He died on the cross and satisfying the righteousness of God. And through that, when that justice was done, peace between God and humanity was established through Christ. The justice happened, peace was established, and then we become reconciled to each other. So there's a solution to the whole conflict. Is that biblical equation? Justice has to happen. Palestine, then peace would come, and then reconciliation. And there's no way out of this. And justice has to come to the Palestinians for any kind of peace to be established in the land.
Right. And on the love your enemies, the example of Jesus, being tortured and murdered, and then saying,
forgive them,
Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And I think that the key is, like, the people are brainwashed into doing things. And when we realize they don't know what they're doing because they're programmed or they're brainwashed, or for that matter, they do have some legitimate grievances, lots of them. In the case of Hamas, they're responding to those grievances in a violent way, which we can denounce, but they have, we can understand why they're doing it, right? So this is really very important, and I'd love to see that paper you were talking about, where people, the theologians, Palestinian Christian theologians, were denouncing what's going on here, because we'll put that in the show notes, and that's really good. That's a really good resource to have.
Sure.
But this has been a great conversation, Daniel. We could go on and on. I might end up breaking this up into different parts and everything, because we've already gone almost an hour and a half. But I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. Is there any other final thoughts that you have before we close?
Yeah, I think I alluded to it. So first, you need to do your work. You need to like, before you say anything about the Middle East, you need to understand what you're talking about. Like I said, I'll provide a link to resources people can look up and study and read. And for the Christians, if your theology, if your faith is, or your belief in the end times or the eschatology is leading you to dehumanize people, to turn a blind eye to suffering, to justify evil and killing, like using Christian biblical language, you need to repent. Like, you need to repent of this violent theology that is hurtful and this dehumanizing. Right. And rather than being these unabashed supporters of war and death, like, just look at Christ and adopt the way of the cross and this idea of the kingdom of God, a kingdom of justice and peace. And Christians in the West, and this is a legacy, so like another can of worms, this legacy of empire, of the Christian empire and Christian power and Christian violence in the West. You need to come to terms with this legacy of Christian violence that you inherited, whether it's the European colonialism or oppression or just bloodshed and slavery, and even today, like how Christian nationalism shows, it kind of rears its ugly face right now in the US. There's a lot of work that people and Christians in the West need to do of rejecting and repenting from these ways and pursuing the ways of justice. And lastly, you need like work actively towards peace and justice in the land. I'm not asking you to be involved because you're not involved. The church in the West is involved. It's involved in tourism. It's involved in funding and support for Israel. It's involved in the politicians, in Christian politicians. Like, the church is involved in all this. You have pastors who preach Israel every weekend. So you need to do your work. You need to like move away from this discourse and go meet Palestinians, go study pursue peace and justice. When you go on your pilgrimage, rather than looking at churches and taking pictures of churches, how about you spend time with those people who left these churches open for you? Go meet with the Palestinians. If you can't meet with the Muslims, meet with the Palestinian Christians. 1% of the land are Christians right now. Go come alongside them, listen to their stories, and come alongside them in pursuit of peace and justice in the land. So I'll leave it to that.
Oh, that's well said. Thank you, Daniel. I would say go visit the Palestinian Muslims too. I
Yes,
lived
please.
with Muslims for 7 years in Africa. I had one of the most
Wonderful.
rewarding experiences of my life. So
if that's too hard for people because of their own biases, but
I understand that. I understand that, but it doesn't take long for the biases to fall when you really meet a family and you experience it. So so all right, well, we've run out of time. Thank you so much, Daniel.
Thanks, Michael.
And by the way, I'll give my shameless plug. If you read my book behind me, Breaking Bad Faith, I cover a lot of these things in that book, and it talks about the two-faced God. Christians believe, modern Christians, most of them, there's always exceptions, thankfully, like yourself and many other people, but a lot of modern Christians believe in a two-faced God, and that's why they easily embrace the violence or war or support a war, is because they think God is two-faced, because they believe certain things in Scripture or from history, etc. And we need to break that. So So again, thank you so much, Daniel. We'll look for your show resources that you're going to give us and put that in the show notes. Is there anything that any kind of a website that you have that you want to share?
I'm not like a public figure. I probably should work on that, but I'm launching a podcast with some friends on Palestine and the US on faith and politics. It's called Across the Divide. I'll send you the link to that as well. We're actually launching in a few days.
Oh, good. All right. We'll put that link in there too. And then we got another podcast to listen to. Great.
Perfect. Okay. Sounds good.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
hey,
Michael.
folks, until the next episode, we'll see you then. Take care.